It's perfect.
All
Welcome
right.
everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is the Bucky Inspired series. Honored to have Curt McNamara here, continuing the series on his book. Today, the topic is diagramming. Over to you, Curt.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So if you've seen the previous presentations, you know that I'm working on a book about Bucky's ideas, and we started with comprehensive anticipatory design science. And we've done one session on comprehensivity, if you will, one on anticipatory, and another one on design science. And this one, when I reflected on what probably is most useful to the reader, it seemed like it was more in the area of what I'll call applications. And so what we're going to try and do tonight is explore some ways that these ideas of Bucky can help us in our own work, our own designs and activities, because you'll recall that everyone is a designer. There's what we call big D design, where we're working on an official product or something like that. But there's also little d, where we're planning a dinner party or arranging our books or whatever. So this presentation says Design Science Toolbox, because I think that we're looking at a set of tools that will help us implement the ideas. So you've seen this one before, if you've seen the previous, which is From Everything I Know, 42 Hours of Buckminster Fuller. And this is him explaining the comprehensive is from the general to the particular, and anticipatory is looking towards the future and designing in the future. And then design being deliberate practice of creation, design science being the generalized principles and the methodology to accomplish this sort of thing. And of course, we're anticipating the needs of humanity, the needs of nature. And as Bucky said, it's kind of our job to do this. So at some time ago, I suppose in the 1980s, Medard Gable and Howard Brown put together a design science primer, and it's still available, that version, in PDF form in a variety of places, including the Global Solutions Lab, that I think just starts this week, where Medard leads people through the design science planning process, and they work on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So they developed this chart showing this design science, or the CADS process, I should say, and as they put it here, design science planning process. So the first part of it is you choose what to work on. And so the first step says you choose a problem situation. So this is typically a challenge or something that you feel could be improved, increasing delivery, making things better. Then you go through and you sort of say, well, what's really happening in this situation? What are the problems? Then you look forward to the future and say, well, what would a world look like without these things? And then you also say, and where are we at today? And then you head towards design. And we're not going to get into design today. We're just working on the front end stuff. So once again, it's always good to refer back to what Bucky recommended, that we work on things that increase living rate. We're not using this process to make gadgets. We're not using it to make money. We're using it to improve living rate for people and to improve our relations to nature, to restore nature. And so then if you see the numbers on the left, that means it's from synergetics. And so this is just some words from synergetics about deciding what to do. And universe consists of the most reliable technology. So Bucky technology was nature, even more so than stuff that we did. He thought that our technology was not compared to nature. And the bottom item, nature continuously self-regenerates with 100% efficiency. And what that means is that everything is captured in some other system. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So how did he recommend we go about doing this, of choosing this problem situation and deciding where to start? He called it tuning in. And this is an illustration from synergetics, and it won't be easy to read on your screen, but take my word for it, that this inner circle, the segmented inner circle, that's where we're looking, that's where we're working. It's a little easier to see at the bottom where you can see the double line circle. That's where we're looking, where we're working. We've tuned into the situation. And so as we do so, we're aware of systems that are larger, and those are the outer circles, and also ones that are smaller, and that's inside the double circle. And it turns out that those systems that are larger are slower, it turns out. And so if we think about something we're doing, which might have a time frame of days, we can think about, oh, but I'm living on a planet with seasons, which, you know, occur on a quarterly or even monthly basis. And then, of course, much larger ones as well. So if we're becoming aware of the systems around us, the larger and slower systems, it can help to think not just of the physical thing, like the size of the Earth, but it can also help to look at slower time scales, like, oh, this particular thing just happens once a year. And then once again, if we go down into the smaller systems within the situation, we see things that are all faster. So I'm talking at a particular speed right now, but in the meanwhile, there are systems inside me that are racing along, aren't they? Make sure everything happens, right? That the air comes in and oxygen gets captured and things are filtered out of the blood and etc. This is described pretty well in a book called The Fuller Explanation by Amy Edmondson. And she was giving you the example that if you come into a room, you wind up zooming into something, and that is your system of interest. And it could be a chair, right? Or it could be a detail of the chair, or it could be a book on the table. At that moment, you've tuned in. That's the double line in the middle of that diagram we just looked at. And so then you're aware the room is around you, and it's larger and slower, isn't it? And you're aware of the things inside the chair or inside the book, which are smaller and faster. And so those are available to you as resources, but they're not sort of at the level of design situation itself. So Bucky emphasized this in several ways. This is from a essay, I'll call it, Requirements for Dwelling Advantage. And it's in one of the World Design Science Decade documents. And here is an example of how he tuned into thinking about shelter. So the double dashed line in the middle is where he's looking, and he said that's the dwelling. And then within the dwelling is the human organism, and within the human organism are like the microscopic bugs, I suppose, that are in my digestive system. And then there's things that are outside that are slower. And so he has a nice list of all the things that a shelter does to protect you against and to create that safe environment. And you can see some of those things in this. So this is how Bucky said we should start. So I thought, how do we make this material applicable to other people who may be familiar with a design method or who may be familiar with something related to systems? And I said, well, what different methods, design methods and process methods are out there that do the same sort of thing, right? They tune into a problem situation and decide what to work on. And so there's design thinking, often called human-centered design. And in that case, we go and interview people who are directly involved and find out who they are, what they're like, and how they view the situation. There's another technique called the rich pictures, where you focus on a person typically and the challenges that surround them and the resources that surround them. And that's was developed as something called soft systems methodology, which is a way of making sort of a stock and flow representation or system dynamics representation. But it's a nice entry point because anybody can do it and you can share it with other people. So it's a really great thing. This gets us to the next thing, is that there's a huge literature and all kinds of stuff on systems thinking and mapping. And typically you will have some sort of, sometimes they call them blobs, and they'll be connected with arrows, and those arrows indicate influence. And the reason we concentrate on these blobs and arrows is that we're looking at behavior, system behavior, when we're doing systems thinking and mapping. And so then we sometimes call those influence diagrams and those arrows feedback. And a typical example would be comparing your bank account to a bathtub. So you could have water coming in to fill it up, and you could have water draining out. And that could be income coming into your bank account as well as expenses flowing out. You can then work on a diagram, a diagram like this, with these lines influence, and look at how they're connected together. They call this sometimes causal mapping. And so then you can see the loops, right? Where one thing influences something which influences something else, and then it comes back once again to the first one. And when that happens, it turns out that there's a sort of a standard set of things that can sort of quote unquote go wrong, or are characteristic of systems that display behavior that we might want to change. And those are known as system archetypes. And Donella Meadows and Peter Senge are most well known for defining those, and there's a lot of material on them. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And those are methods that are not analogous, but in some ways they're similar to, Bucky's ideas of comprehensive anticipatory design and tuning in. And then on the right, we have a number of things that have developed, and they're very much in line with Bucky's thinking. And many people believe that these were inspired by his, perceptions and writings on the environment and regeneration and nature. And so there's life cycle thinking, and a good example of that is called circular design or circularity. Another one is, in a similar way, it talks about closing the loop, so that things we make either return to nature or they return into what's called a technical nutrient cycle. So they're turned into other stuff. Like when you recycle an aluminum can, you turn it into something else useful. And then biomimicry thinking is similar. There's a bunch of stuff here, guys. Sorry, but it seemed like it was worthwhile to look at these. So then briefly on each one, there's sort of 4 big steps in design thinking. And the one on the front end is you're going to empathize by talking to people, being empathic and capturing their stories. And you might do what's on the left is create what they call the composite character profile, or sometimes that's called a persona. And then once you have an idea of the actual issue, then you do something like on the lower left, where you produce a very simple situation. They call this a Mad Lib. And this is like, aha, we can see the challenge. And then you show this thing back to the people you're working with, to the stakeholders, and they help you modify it. So they start with these 2 things. There's a lot of other stuff they do to capture the situation, and we won't be able to get into it tonight. This is an image of a rich picture. This is one that's related to a work situation, and you can see the operator in the middle, various things related to work, as well as issues, right, that the operator is having, Jenny is having. And so this lets you start to draw these causal loops and make a system map or model. And part of this, part of rich pictures is defining what's called the CATWO, which is a mnemonic, I guess, or whatever, for who is the customer and the actor, what's the transformation happening in the system, what's the worldview, if you will, who's the owner of it, and what's the environment. So the rich picture does a really, really pretty good job in many ways of having you, at least in a text format, describe many things about stuff surrounding the system and stuff that's impacting the system. So this is a good one to remember. And then this is a system map, but it's done with concept mapping. And then concept mapping, one of the advantages of a concept mapping tool is that when you draw an arrow, it will put a place in the middle of it for a word. So you can't have a relation that doesn't have some definition. In systems thinking in general, you don't really define the relations quite this much. They tend to be something like increases or decreases, and you have a little bit of finer detail, I guess, for the blobs. But this is an interesting one because it shows one way to think about how to move something like your household from, let's just say, factory food towards more sustainable or even regenerative food sources, all the stuff that's influencing it. So this is something where we've now started to bring in these external sources. So they're outside this, the line that we'd say defining the household, aren't they? And yet they impact it, right? The media impacts it, our peers impact it. So these are things that aren't actually in the design situation itself, but they surround it, or they're what we call adjacent to it, and they really impact it. And this is the kind of thing that Bucky was saying we should look at and be aware of. And then this is an image from the Wikipedia page and system archetypes. And they put it in because you can see in the red, they have said there's certain things that you find when you map a system where these challenges or archetypes come about, and they're sort of standard built-in patterns that just develop. But in the books and the articles about them, they also suggest fixes. And so it just gives you a sense of the richness. And once again, this is a methodology focused on the problem situation and the behavior and how you could influence or change the behavior. And now we're going to switch a little bit and talk about this big picture life cycle thinking. So when we say life cycle thinking, what we mean is everything we do, we need to get some stuff. We need to get some resources or energy or something. And it comes from the earth, and that has impacts, right? If we buy something, it's made from pieces that come from factories and forests and mines, and it gets transported and transformed. And a lot of that times has a very large impact on the earth. And then we put it together, and that has other impacts, and then we use it, which, you might need batteries or printer paper or ink or something, or electricity. So there's impacts there. And then finally, we got to get rid of it. And very much of our stuff is set to be returned to the earth or to be put back into what they call technical nutrient cycles. So at the top is a very general one that talks about this. On the lower left is one that's not from cradle to cradle, but it's very similar to cradle to cradle, which talks about the biological cycle, where if we, for example, grow food and bring it in the house and eat a certain amount of it, and the stuff we don't eat goes back into a compost pile, it becomes biological nutrients, right? And so then that's a fairly closed loop localized system. Whereas we get something from a factory farm, right? Lots of negative impacts just in the production of it, and many things are just dumped in the environment. Really bad stuff in factory farms. And then we might decide to just throw the stuff away. And then, of course, it doesn't get captured back in biological cycle. It goes into landfill where it's just stuck forever. And in this sense, in the right, then we have the technical nutrient cycle, where this is like the aluminum can or, the aluminum automobile that gets smelted down and turned into something else. On the right is what they call the eco-design strategy wheel that helps designers think about different ways they could do reuse and recapture such that they have a lower impact overall. And then circularity is really the current version of this, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has enormous amounts of material on it. And this is a very large topic in the European Union. There are standards that are coming into play. Many companies have signed on to circularity. And the idea is to just, on everything you do, be aware of what's happening, be aware of the impacts that goes into as that goes out of. And so then this particular one, basically has the biological on the left side and the technical on the right side. It's the same thing in many ways. And then this one's included because it turns out in circularity, you can see in the upper left, your household waste can be part of circularity, right? You can see on the bottom, just thinking about what you're doing, how you're doing it in your company is going to impact circularity. It's important to realize that, a change of only a few percent that happens every year will quickly add up to be much more impactful, if you will, than you think. So don't be disappointed, take heart, we're making progress. All right, so then how do we show this stuff? We've already seen Bucky's diagrams, where we have the inner circle and the outer circle. We talk about slower and larger, and we talk about faster and smaller. And so then this is some work, well, actually informal versions of some work I did related to biomimicry. It was actually done for the Biomimicry Institute, and it's a tool called the System Explorer. And these were initial sketches, but it shows the idea a little more clearly than some. And so you have the super system surrounding what you're working on, and in the middle, and I'm looking at the upper left now, you see the design, the organism, what you're thinking about, and you automatically start to add in these lines to just show the interchange, the interface, resources coming in or waste going out. And then you start to think about the subsystems and modules that are within, because those are important. Often the system behavior comes from the parts and how they interact, what we call emergence, Bucky called synergy. And then it also talks about systems that are next to you, because those can be pretty important in what you're doing. In the lower right one, it's a little bit more with a business sense, and you can see that the super system now might be the environment or might be the economy. You can see money, materials, energy, and workers coming in, and money and waste and products going out, and adjacency as well. So different stuff there. And then I worked up a version of this that's in the draft book, where I said, how would you go through this sort of thinking if you're just going to do something like building a shed? How important is it to think about, the larger systems if you're building a shed? Well, it could impact the neighbors if it was close to a property line. It could be close to the house. That could be good or it could be bad, right? There could be runoff from the house that makes your shed very unhappy. There could be things at the level of community that you need to be aware of in terms of regulatory stuff. It could be that a neighbor has resources to help you build it, raw materials or expertise or something like that. So we start to think about it, you're like, oh yeah, it's fairly obvious that just slowing down to think about the larger and slower systems, can yield benefits and does not take us a long time. And this is basically what Bucky was telling us. So a little bit more on big picture thinking. And in big picture thinking, I referred to biomercury. This is the biomercury design lens. And so on the left, you see the three big core principles of it. So ethos is that we feel connected to nature. We're empathic with nature. We understand how important she is. And then on the right, reconnect means, and it's not just that, but we're out in nature, we're spending time, we're learning, we're doing stuff. And then finally, we get to this step what we call emulate, where we're like, okay, how do we make a better thing? Something with less impact? How can we learn from nature? And on the right, they have life's principles. So they've looked through and they said, well, how do living systems operate? When we do our work or design work or personal projects, we often don't think of how we could do it with respect to how nature does it. And so then there's 6 big ideas, if you will, that are in green in the middle. There's, I think, 4 larger ones around the outside, and then many more in the middle. But the really critical thing is in the center, which is life creates conditions conducive to life. And this is Bucky's nature's endlessly root. So this is a very powerful thing and very useful. And then it turns out there's a similar approach in a book called The Way Life Works by Hoagland and Dobson. And they talk about life's patterns, and they have a slightly different take on it. And so it might be more accessible to certain people. And in this graph or chart or mind map, I guess, I overlay the 2 of them to say how they really are kind of in the same, 5 general areas. And yeah, so if we wanted to design things like life does under strategies, we realize we should organize with information, right? That's our DNA and things like that. We maintain via turnover. The reason that I'm still kicking, or as Bucky said, famously, sure, I came back to this lecture hall 40 years later, but the only thing that's the same is my eyeglasses, because every cell in my body is replaced every 7 years. So anyway, there's a lot of power in knowing this and doing it. And it's just it's a reflection of what Bucky said about endlessly regenerative. All righty then. So now we're back up to how do we do this? And one view would be we develop our own design science toolboxes. What it would be in them? Well, today we're talking about comprehensive. How do we get that first picture, that first initial picture? And then we'll go a little bit, dip our toe into anticipatory, just a tiny bit. And so then in the upper right, you can see some of the aspects of tuning in to be aware of. And I'll mention that the diagramming that Bucky talked about is an example of what's called extended cognition. And I think my next slide talks about this as well. And what that means is it's things outside your brain and your body that you create. You may create them just for yourself to really understand what's going on. And Feynman, the physicist, was a key proponent of this. Or it may be something where you're sharing it with somebody else, and the two of you work together on a shared understanding. But it's the act of diagramming, putting something on paper that changes stuff. It's not the same as your thoughts. This is very clear. And so this is what's called extended cognition. It's part of what they call the 4 E's of cognition. So there's also embodied and et cetera, but the extended one is the one we're going to look at. We're going to do this, and we're going to do it, in the way we've, are familiar with, and Bucky talked about, doing basically systems mapping and modeling. And there's lots of different ways to do this. There's lots of reasons we create a certain map or diagram or model. We might be interested in the behavior over time, or we might be interested in how it's constructed in space, if you will, or structured, if you will. We might be more interested in how the energy flows, or what Medard calls the metabolics that Bucky often talked about. And we might use one of a whole variety of diagramming techniques. But here's the deal. All these, it turns out, can be aided by Bucky's emphasis that we need to consider this bigger picture, the larger systems that are out there. Okay, so here's the extended cognition slide. And we kind of talked about this. The what of it is diagrams and sketches and notes. We use it to explore, to design, to figure out alternatives. And then on the types, we've talked about a number of these things over on the left. And some of it does overlap. Much of it overlaps the other process we talked about, like design thinking, et cetera. So we're thinking about comprehensive. Bucky's comprehensive is an example of extended cognition, that we're going to wind up expressing something in a language of relations. Well, that's absolutely what he said, right? It says systems are just relations. They're not, static things stuck together. They're just the relations making it all stick together. We also remember what he told us about the whole point of this, that we use operational mathematics, and what that means is only what's true in here and now for us. We don't pretend that the reality is what we were taught in grade school about infinite planes and, lines and points that don't exist, right? But we do know that a tetrahedron works, right? Because we can build one just like he did, and we can press it, and we understand it separates space into two, et cetera. Often that it's coupled forces. Even in the single relation, it's often coupled forces. It's more than one line. Systems are closed. Yeah, there's more here that we can get to. So then I wanted to go back and talk a little bit about modelability. And this was another key idea of Bucky's, which is that at some point, and he talks about scientists often, they went away from being able to, or from wanting or trying to make models, and said, well, no, it's just equations. And that we lost a great deal when it happened. And we lost really a bunch of people who would love to know more about science, because it was put in only in this very advanced mathematics that was not accessible. So he really emphasized that modelability is just like he says, 900.21. It's a book about models, humanly conceptual models, criminally simple, holistically identifying those models, and they're transformative and generalized accountings. And that models are generalization, that the forms with your special case. And at the bottom, our thoughts, right? Our systems are geometrically shaped and modelable. And if you look in the list of topics in the Synergetics Dictionary for model, look at the things he left us. OMG, there's at least 40. And these really have not been explored at any great depth. I mean, there's certain ones that have been, but there's just an enormous amount of stuff here that is applicable to many, many things, far beyond where I'll be able to get with the book. So here is our guy, and this is his design science laboratory, right? He liked to model hands-on. He liked to sketch. If you look at any of the books about the artifacts, like My Private Sky, you see all that kind of stuff. If you read about how synergetics was written and they get a draft and then you realize, wait a minute, it's actually different because now I see it written down, right? It was very much extended cognition and action over extended period of time with an weight. And here is a slide. And it really is, I think, a good, easy way to think about operational mathematics. And he's like, what was I really doing when I was thinking? I was separating sort of things outside from things inside, right? And I was not using any axioms, and axioms means things like they're assumed a priori to be true, like the infinite plane. I was just working with what exists right there in front of me. And he made the point that Einstein and others have done that. Yeah. So anyway, it sometimes seems confusing, but it's really pretty simple, right? It's using our sense data first and only the things that are in front of us, as opposed to making too many assumptions about things for operational mathematics. Okay, so then what could we do? Well, this is just me goofing around a little bit. I said, well, most of the things that we're going to look at, we have some people, right? And some users, and they're inside a situation. And here's that dashed line again. So that's what we're thinking about. And so this is our first step of saying, okay, well, I might have done some work in design thinking, or some work in rich picturing, or some work in system mapping, but I need a big picture right now, right? And so this is just the very first steps of how could we make this as a simple process. So obviously the environment goes around everything else. And now you start to think, oh, well, what's going into the situation? Like we talked about in life cycle thinking, what things are we consuming? What's the energy? What's the food? What's the resources? Where is this coming from? What are the interchanges to the environment? And what is the waste coming out of it? So for whatever we do, right, if it's our dinner party, where are we getting the food? Where does it come from? Is it quote unquote sustainable or organic? What do we do with the waste when we're done with it? What kind of utensils do we do? Do we buy plastic and throw it away so we don't have to wash it? So we can use the thinking on anything that we do. And then the other thing that we didn't really delve into yet, but it's worth mentioning, the other bigger and slower systems that surround us also really influence what we're up to. So we think about the socio-cultural system, right? So culture, society, media, and et cetera. There's a bunch of constraints on how we can act. There's only certain things that we can do before we sort of break off from society and start to form our own whatever. So that social cultural might completely enclose the situation, often it does, or we might decide we have to create a new model. And so then the situation is only partially overlapping, but we can't ignore it, right? There's forces coming in that affect us. And then based on our internal beliefs and the way we operate, then we interact with it, and the result is behavior. So we need to be aware of the social cultural stuff, and then economic stuff, what I'm calling transactional. So, most of us don't have infinite choice in what kind of a job we have, and the jobs are always compromises, right? When Bucky wanted to sell his bathrooms, he had to create a new model to sell his high efficiency bathrooms. So these are big systems that we should be aware of, and sometimes we can trim tab them, right? We can make small changes and change the direction of the system a little bit. Sometimes we can do a different form of systems coupling or procession to work with things differently. But sometimes, like I said, you have to just create the new model. And then it's important to say, well, okay, Mr. McNamara, you listed a couple things there, but that's not necessarily comprehensive. Well, Bucky left us the design science strategies. And so then this does cover many of the things that we talked about, with other ones as well. And so part of this is just being continually aware of the latest developments in each of these things right now. And part of it is just using a very structured approach when we go through this. So we have a pretty good guide from him. So then where are we at with this whole thing? I know I'm racing through it. So when we're using this comprehensive retuning and process, we're raising our awareness and representation of the boundaries of the situation. Boundaries are important because that's the only way we can interact with the system. Boundaries are important because that's how external forces come in and interact with us. And so we need to be aware of that. Boundaries are where we get access to resources like the forces of gravity and electromagnetics and what nature has to offer, sunlight, etc. This is enhanced by design science discipline and also remembering that we as people are polyhedrons. We can model ourselves polyhedral. And one of the advantages now on the mind map on the right is that we start to think this way, then the situation, we're more aware of how it fits into what I'll call an ecosystem. And an ecosystem is not just the natural environment, but it's an ecosystem of the transactional or economic environment. It's an ecosystem of the social cultural environment. Maybe we have to form a new niche and move away often to get done what we're done. But I think by using those insights, it helps us. And once again, that insight is enabled by being aware of the boundary, what we're working with right now, and then the outside and inside forces. So far we're just in the flat, aren't we? But it turns out the systems are polyhedral, they're in 3 space. And so these are images made from VZome, which is virtual Zome and freely available and easy to play with. And it just shows a number of systems kind of floating in space and then it's sort of a boundary around them. Now, it's not true to form at all because it turns out the boundary is really comprised of the systems that are within, right? So if you think about a company, the boundary isn't, well, in some cases, of course, it's a physical wall, but often it's actually a person, right? Answering a phone or doing a transaction. So often, the whole situation, the boundary of the system is composed at least partially of the people. And so tuning in means being aware of it. And then this is just another view showing these systems floating in space. And then yet a little more of a close-up. And then, so what are these polyhedral systems in there? And how are they coupled together? So it turns out that, Bucky reminded us that systems have 3 ways to couple together. You can have a single point of contact, so it's more like a gas, and the different systems are just free to just roll around, do all kinds of things. You can have 2 points of contact, and so this is more like a liquid, there's more like a hinge, but it turns out this also is a good metaphor for every time that we relate to something else. Instead of just taking, we return something. We know this in relationships. It's super clear in relationships that we can't just take and take. It won't be sustainable. We need to give back. We need to have both of them flowing in the same way with Earth. We know now that if we just take and take and take, eventually things give out. We need to give back. This is the whole basis of regenerative design. So this is a key thing and should start to come into both the previous picture as well as how the previous picture would have related to the larger systems. And then this is just an illustration from Synergetics showing this coupling in the way he drew it here. When you have more than 2 points of contact, then the systems can actually bond together and become a singular system at a sort of a higher level of organization. But once again, everything's a polyhedra, including you and I, right? Obviously, we're a convex polyhedra defining our physical body, but also we're a metaphysical polyhedra. We take in things like Shrikant's meetups, and we put things out like our words and thoughts and our notes. And we relate to things pretty much only if we get that exchange, right? Job, they just took and took. We wouldn't be there. Same with the relationship. So we are polyhedron if we make simple sketches of ourselves, showing, right, that we have certain things that we're putting out in the world, some things we need back. It'll help us think about that coupling and how we can build higher level stuff. Here's a student example, just showing something was done over class long ago. So then I started at some point to say, well, how would you do it? Do you start with this rough wavy line? Do you start to think about what's inside it? What's outside it? So this is not fully developed, but I'm working on ideas like this. I should mention now, we're going to flip over to anticipatory. And excuse me. So this is from trees or TRIZ through inventive problem solving. And really the system operator or explorer I showed you earlier is a version of system operator. And one of the things that is nice about this is that you have three columns: the past on the left, the present in the middle, and the future on the right. And so the situation in the middle is where you're at, the design that you're trying to fix or create, the thing you want to do. And this diagram, if you work through it, shows you, oh, well, what are the subsystems of the challenge in the present? So that's the lower middle. What are the super systems of the challenge today? And that's the upper middle. But it also has the right-hand column. And so the right-hand column in the middle, you'd have the preferred future, wouldn't you? You'd have the situation as it's solved or fixed. But you'd understand that that can only happen if there was a super system that evolved as you went through it, right? And it might require change subsystems as well. So this is a very nice, simple diagram, similar to the things we're going to look at. So here we have, once again, just very initial sketches of this anticipatory stuff. So what do we know? The situation as it is today will be changed into a different situation in the future and will be changed as well. So we can start to just draw diagrams where we can see this and start to think about the changes. And then we can bring in things like other systems, the adjacency we talked about, right? Often it's the adjacent systems that were around us that really have an impact. So there's the system A and the system B that exist today. But as time goes on, there's also a change system A and a change system B in the future. So obviously this needs a lot of work to make this a useful tool. But I think to graphically show how the future or anticipated system, the preferred future, sort of is kind of overlaid, right? It's a potential thing that exists. It won't happen if we just let stuff happen, right? If we just let stuff happen, the future develops based on trends and things we see today. So we need to identify this preferred future and figure out the pathways, if you will, so that, us, the users, they have moved in this new situation. The situation itself has changed. And, likelihood, the surrounding systems have to change as well. Whether we help them or we just can find a way to bootstrap on them, another question. So here you go. It's your blank page. How would you start this? What would you think about? And so this is kind of the challenge, if you will, for our discussion is I need feedback. What seems useful in this? What would you draw in? Where would we go with it? Once we get there, and this will be for future, we'll start to talk about strategies you can use to get there. Of course, Bucky had a bunch of them. And yep, and then basically we're into those now, and that'll actually be the next presentation. So yeah, that's it. There you go.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Curt. All right, folks. So Curt has put some questions on the table. You can answer them, or you can ask general questions. You can make any comments about the presentation, anything you want to do. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark. This is going to be interactive, so would love to hear from as many of you as possible. So go ahead and type an exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to make comments. We're going to let's start with Jeannie first. Jeannie, go ahead.
Curt, I'm just not clear what you mean by a phrase. What is that? Did I miss something?
Do you say by a phrase?
A phrase.
Sure. Yeah, just probably moving too fast. It was a suggestion that it could be useful, when thinking about a challenge, is a phrase like, regenerative food systems might be such a thing, or improved healthcare might be such a thing. Maybe a phrase isn't quite the right, you know what I'm saying? But often we can find, if we try and keep it, a little more compact, it'll help us explore the situation. So that was the intent.
So in other words, defining a problem verbally by, several words that would stick together and kind of get the whole thing.
Yes, as a way to start, and as you go through, start to share it with other people, they'll say, well, but what about this, Curt or Shrikant, and you'll start to change it. But yeah, often it's better to start simpler, I think, than with a really big, but it's all like, because often if we're starting to get really detailed, it turns out we're almost always imagining a solution. And Bucky emphasized, and all the others processes emphasize as well, don't get stuck on solutions before you start. Try and find a challenge, or in biomechanics they say, figure out what the function is. It's not a better car, it's not even maybe transportation, maybe it's something more general like movement. So yeah, the idea is to keep it general and simple to start with.
Thank you. One of my favorite quotes by Louis Sullivan is, a problem contains its own solution. So most of the work actually goes in identifying what the problem is. Next up is going to be Joe.
Hi, Curt. Thank you again for joining us. I mean, it's always it's always a pleasure to have you here, and that's a lot of work. So we appreciate it. One of the things that I actually think about is in drawing these circles. Obviously, there's a focus on the environment and being regenerative in those circles. What are some of the measures that would actually be used in order to determine that type of progress is being made? So I think in one area would be an example of ephemeralization, that you're doing more with less, right? So there should be some metrics that, and I'm not a big person to manage the metrics, believe me. But nonetheless, there should be some measurement by which you can determine that you're doing more with less. And I think that this is actually a really big when they go with innovation many times. So the type of innovation that we've seen in order to see economic growth has still used a lot of resources. So the energy consumption has not necessarily gone down. So in that, with that as an idea, what type of metrics would actually be applicable in these circles if in order to determine that you're actually making progress? And then there's other decisions that have to be made throughout that too, right? Is that it may, the initial cost of starting, so to speak, and I'm not talking about, let's call them cosmic accounting, be high, but they may go down over time, and that's another aspect of it. But that's just anyway. What type of metrics is my question? And I mean, and it obviously is going to be relative to the type of business that you're in. I understand that, but generally speaking, there's got to be something along this line where you're looking at resources, you're looking at environmental impact, you're looking at economic growth, all the systems that you drew circles with. So anyway, I know it's a long drawn out question, but
that's good. Excuse me. So life cycle analysis is the most well-defined method. And so that's an aspect of life cycle thinking, a very structured one. And so there's software out there, there's open source stuff, as well as stuff like Sustainable Minds that can be used. And it is more oriented towards products than processes, but there are ways to use it for processes. And so for example, if I was going to do something like this button that, got made recently for something I was at, I would say, well, what are the components of the button? Well, it's got this spring pin in it. Oh, well, what's that made out of, right? And it's got this metal backer. What's that made out of? Oh, and it's got a, plastic translucent cover. Oh, what's that made of? Oh, and it's got this printed thing in, which means paper, but it also means printing, which also means pigments. You see where I'm going with this, right? And so then there are tables that have been developed over decades, and there's a method to change the tables, but they look at the impacts in a variety of ways, including the environment itself, toxicity to humans, excessive energy use, degradation of the environment. It's several things they look at. And so you can then take something like the button and you can run what they call LCIA, life cycle impact assessment. And it's not actually that difficult. I've done it in the systems classes for years. And it'll show you something. And what do you do with the something? You say, well, so what if I made this button differently? I used a different kind of process. I didn't use plating. I used a different kind of material, etc. It allows you to compare then two things, one to the other. So that's one way it's used. Another one is to say, well, what's the biggest impact of this right now? And then you can say, well, I just want to work on the biggest impact to reduce it. So that's kind of the standard way, and it doesn't touch on many of the things you mentioned. There are other ways to look at the things you've mentioned. I recommend, now I have to get it right. There's a book by Hubbard, and basically on modeling. And the byline is the use of intangibles in business. And so we know that if we model something like efficiency, we can get quite good at being efficient at what we're doing, but we're probably going to ignore a lot of other things that are very important to the business, right? Like developing new things or doing whatever. And so in Hubbard's book, he emphasizes many of these things are intangible, and it'll pay you very well to pay attention to it. And another example would be, as a writer, you could say, well, excuse me, I'm only interested in measuring the number of words. Well, that's probably not a very good measure, of your accomplishment per day. And it may be just the time spent on task might be better, et cetera. So there's different ways to measure things, I guess. Nothing is totally well developed. I think it's good to develop your own metrics, if you will, and remember that, don't get too disappointed once you actually see the numbers, right? That even a small percentage improvement, on a yearly basis will start to really add up. And the biomimicry, life's principles, I show you that chart with all the stuff around it. What they do is their approach, they say, is once you figured out what the function is you want to recreate or emulate or use nature to, come up with a better solution of, as you even start to think about it, think about how nature would accomplish things, right? Nature would use this kind of a strategy and that kind of a strategy. So think of that ahead of time, even before you really start the design process. So I'm dancing around your question. The answer is there's no real one way. We know some things that don't work, right? You've probably heard of LEED, the architectural way to evaluate buildings. And it turns out it's very well intended, right? You can do this and you can do that and offset it and you can become gold or whatever. But it's now been proven by a number of studies that you can actually just game the thing. And in some cases, LEED certified buildings are worse than something that didn't go through the process at all. So there's nothing, that's really going to be one overall solution. It's just one of these things we just got to keep working on. One of the things about life cycle analysis, there is a standard European standard, and it doesn't say exactly how to do it, but it says that the process should be open. It should be available for others to look at and critique. And that avoids cases where once again, you can gamify life cycle impact assessments. You can do one that claims a Hummer is more efficient than a Prius, right? Because the way you emphasize things and how you choose all the factors and stuff, and you just know intuitively it's wrong, right? But it looks real, it's written up and it's supposedly done all the stuff. But by the process, by the European Union process, by having it open, having it critiquable, that allows you to sort of come at a more sensible approach to it. So anyway, dance around it, but that's because that's kind of a tough topic.
Wonderful, thank you. So folks, I want to get as many questions from as many people on the table as possible. So go ahead and type an exclamation mark. While you're typing exclamation marks, I have a question. So, thanks to Bucky, I've been a big fan of diagramming. But thanks to Bucky, I've moved from diagrams to kind of 3D models of all kinds that work really, really well for me for multiple reasons. So I want to have your thoughts. I would love your thoughts on the advantages of a diagram on a paper versus, using all kinds of models of all kinds.
Yeah, you're right. You can really only explore the systematicity, or however you want to say that word, of something by having that, right? By having that 3D model and defining the relations. But I will tell you, it's really hard. When I did a chart of open issues in design science, defining systems by relations in a way that held them together, it's pretty darn hard, which means there's huge benefits to it, but it's not, like even a person like me who spends some time at it, I've shown you charts in the past. There's papers up on my website where I say, I tried to do this and I failed. I'm showing it to you, so maybe you can do it better, right? I would do it again now, I'd do better. So I totally agree. And John and Yoshimi should actually comment because they've efficiently used models, and so has Richard Ramsey. But I think for my case, just trying to look at stuff in general, I've had a real challenge. So it is absolutely the way to do it, but it's hard. That's all I'm going to say. So.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll have John and Yoshimi. John and Yoshimi, what are the advantages of using a 3D model versus doing something on paper? What do you think?
For me, it's being in front of the room and watching the faces of the students. I know exactly when the light bulb goes on. And it's usually when I'm not talking, but showing. Yeah. So, yeah, and then I want to comment on Lisa's comment.
Yeah, so to me, the key thing is you can draw anything, you can write mathematics, and people will say, well, that's abstract. Okay, so it doesn't apply in the real world. So here it is in the real world. We've got our diagram for emergently, and we fold it up into a tetrahedron to show you how it can transform. This is real world. It's not an abstract idea. So people can immediately relate to the real world application of the idea. And so I think that's really important to translate concepts and demonstrate, like Bucky did, continuously demonstrate it in the physical. So here's a demonstration of it. And this principle, what you've just seen in reality, scales. This still happens, doesn't matter how long these pieces of wood are, and it still works. Whereas it's kind of difficult to you can say it in words, but it doesn't mean anything to people. But when you can see it, then you can say, yeah, that's scalable. I know what you mean by scalable. It works at different sizes.
I'd like to address Lisa's question.
Go ahead.
Can we have a name or link on the studies that show LEED buildings aren't better than non-LEED buildings? I'm not going to answer that directly, but what we've done here, this house is a PEDO certified living building. So we didn't use the LEED, we used IFLA, the Institute's Jason McClellan's system of building and construction. And it sort of blends with the question I have for Curt and everyone in this room, is what we tried to do in saying why we felt living building was far surpassed LEED or non-LEED or green building standards or whatever, because there's so many standards. Rather than say it surpassed it, we tried to always demonstrate it. And our blog was always written in terms of earth, air, water, fire, firm, clear, calm, bright, which is the basis of the model we created 25 years ago. And the question I have for all of us, and Curt, is the biggest challenge, I think, through all our work, all the work that we are all doing to make a difference and regenerate. Many people do not understand the concept of system. What is a system? So we keep talking, we've got to think whole systems thinking. We've got to look at the big bigger picture. We've got to stand back. They are so in survival mode and looking at their own little
Next
next step system. What's the next step for them to survive? That to jump to a concept, which we always did, of whole systems thinking is continues to be a huge leap. And even for a gift for nature, you know, we try to bring it back to the child, and we said, here's the bigger picture problem. But we want you to look at what's the problem in your local area? And how does maybe some of the bigger pictures about hunger and water, etc., might be, how does that show up in your local system, your small system? So my question to Curt and all of us is, how do we start to shift people from even considering what a whole systems, we talked about nested systems, which makes a little bit of sense, but how do we start to get people to understand whole systems thinking? What is whole systems thinking? What is a system? You know?
Go ahead, Curt.
Okay, and so Lisa, and just the commentary, I may have misspoken. I didn't say that LEED buildings are worse in general. I was trying to say that LEED, like any other methodology, can be gamified, or you can work around it. And now there's been, and I don't have access to those, I could chase them down later, but the thing I posted in there was indicative of what I'm saying is that they've discovered it's not a magic thing. And what John and Yoshimi were mentioning is the living building challenge. I mean, AIA, American Institute of Architects, realized some of the issues with it as they worked with Living Futures Institute or something like that to come up with a living building challenge. And John Yoshimi referred to that. So I think that's better. And yes, anything that I think that starts with the whole system approach, and architects in general, I think, are the best, overall at that. I mean, McDonough, the cradle guy, was an architect. And in many other cases, people I've worked with who are architects just have that, either they were drawn to it because they're big picture visual thinkers, or they developed it by going through the methodology. But I also think that architecture and housing in general is a great way to understand whole systems. And the reason is, we all know how houses are put together. We've all seen it happen. Most of us have worked on a house. We know what goes into, right? We paid the bills. It's an organism in a way that we live inside, and we know enough about maintenance of it, creation of it, and into life of it. So one of the ways, I think, there is not a great answer, Yoshimi, to whole system comprehension. One of the ways I think, though, was to bring it down to things we're familiar with, and in a way, the construction of the shed, the little appendix that I've created for the book, I was attempting to do something like it, just because most of us can imagine putting up a simple shed, right? That, it was a thing that we could work on. I'm trying to think of the gal, Linda Booth Sweeney. She has done a lot of work, especially now with kids. She's got an app, and she's got a book that's been turned into some animations to get kids to they already understand whole systems thinking, at least in a behavioral sense, and it helps them start to put language around, identify it. And so I recommend Linda Booth Sweeney's work as one way to do it. Yeah, unfortunately, like Bucky said, we get it driven out of us, right? As we go through school, the further and further we go, the less and less we're able to do. Well, we can do systems in such a constricted sense, right? We can create this thing, but it's a system it's not really a whole system. I mean, it does persist, it does have systematicity, but it was not developed, right, with concept of the whole in mind. Because often, if you have the concept of the whole in mind, it turns out your solution is actually much simpler or way different than what you thought, right? As opposed to you have a fixed idea about this, what we need. So I got a head nod from John, so that's good.
Thank you, Curt. I just want to make one comment about the diagrams. I mean, diagrams to me is a language, and it serves multiple purposes. There are stages in your thinking where diagrams are a way of getting things on the paper so you can start to explore their connections. So they are at a kind of the beginning stages, and it's critical. You wouldn't be able to get your mind around a problem. But I think what happens in many cases, especially the areas that you care about very deeply, is that you work very hard to make things simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler, so that when you are actually talking to other people, what you are actually showing is a much more simplified version of it. And typically, I think if you have, the thing I love about Bucky doing this is he manages to convert it into like a unit, which is a simple unit that can expand like almost like a fractal in multiple directions. So, but that requires a lot of, so it's like there are diagrams of a certain kind where it's too early, you're still trying to put things together. And then there are points where you're kind of shipping something at the end of a long process, and they're kind of the simplicity. And for actually talking to people, I think that or even like dealing with it yourself to kind of say, okay, I know that this is all the essential connections here. Now let me see what how I can kind of iterate through that in my mind. So when it becomes like a usable thing. So I want to distinguish between like map making. There is a process of making a map, and then there is a process of using a map. So in that stage, I think the 3D things I find them incredibly powerful. I'm a big fan of diagrams, but I do and that's what I've learned from all the Bucky Meetups that we've done. Thank you.
And then just a little tiny bit on that. Go on. Yeah, and what I've learned over time, and it wasn't a thing I actually just learned about from listening and talking with people who do this, is the reason we create a system map or a model is to create joint understanding, right? So I may think the point of the business is thus and such, but if you force me to work with Fred and he's in accounting and he has a whole different sense of it, we're going to have a hard time, right? In a way, but it's the same thing. We're talking about the firm, the business, or whatever. And so we may never come to terms, with him saying, well, really the whole point is to, make sure there's a really solid return on investment every quarter, and enough work for the people. And you saying, well, no, it's to produce really high quality products. You may never resolve it, but you now understand each other. And now if you're in a meeting, you'd be like, you know what? I know where Fred's coming from now. And so then I can alter what I'm doing in a way that overlaps and work towards it. And so they say the value, it's like anything, right? Planning is wonderful, but plans are, not that useful, but it's the whole process, right? That's so useful. So
beautifully put. Absolutely. Excellent point. Thank you. Next up is Jeannie, followed by Katie and Joe. Folks would love to hear from many people. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Jeannie.
Well, I think one of the things about a diagram is that you can put things that are very different on there, like things that are processes or materials or, my own personal feelings. I mean, you could stick God on there. And the things would have very different values. I mean, something, my personal feelings really, amount to nothing in the broader picture, but, they're important to me. So they can be on the diagram, but they're not world, shattering importance. And I think with a polyhedra or, physical model, you tend to want to give the same value to everything that you see. I mean, we could put a little tetrahedron on a big tetrahedron and maybe get some more, depth to it. But there's something about a diagram. It just allows you to put anything in there. I mean, you could put money in. I mean, just anything can go in a diagram. And then if it's not important, you can cross it out or, put it in a little box and stick it away somewhere. But I think that's one of the things of a physical model is difficult. And especially we always use, the perfect polyhedras, and and nothing is really like that in real life.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jeannie.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you made a very good point there. I'm going to grab Koski's irregular tetrahedra here. So, so I never really realized it till you said it. So thank you, Jeannie. But on the diagram, you can put all kind of metaphysical stuff, can't you? And you can actually mix it to a certain extent with the physical. And so that's a huge advantage because guess what? Metaphysical is where the model exists, but it's what drives all the physical stuff, right? It's that interplay of the physical and metaphysical. So the diagrams allow us to bring in that higher level metaphysical knowledge. And the irregularity, I mean, this is not irregular enough, but these are, so Bucky defined these E, S, and T modules, and then David Koski has taken these and said, oh, and it turns out if I scale one of these to the next by phi, which is a fundamental constant in nature, like spirals are based on phi, he gets a sort of a space filling thing, right? That can describe lots of stuff. And this looks a lot more organic, right, than our regular just fixed, platonic solids or whatever. So I really like that idea. And then I zoomed past the student image, which was regular, but the idea is if I was a metaphysical polyhedron, it'd be a mess, right? Might be interesting, but it'd be a mess. So
Thank you. Thank you, Curt. And thank you, Jeannie. Next up is Katie, followed by Joe. Katie.
It seems to me like sometimes I agree on the diagramming, but it seems to me sometimes the problem might be like there's a system over here for the physical and a system over there for the relationships, and we're all impacted by there. So it's the impact goes on to everybody, but the decision making goes. So those are different sets of people, like two diagrams. You have maybe making a car over here, and then you have who's deciding over here the laws around emissions. So those are two different diagrams where one doesn't necessarily have to absorb the impact of what they're doing. So it's two different diagrams. I'm curious what you think on something like that.
yeah, excellent insight. Couldn't agree more. And yeah, occasionally that's to our advantage, but yeah, mostly, we talked about all the well-intentioned things, right, in businesses and elsewhere, that don't have, what they really wanted to have happen when you were done. So that's a great thing. And I just struggle with how to represent it, Katie, just because you quickly get to, this is really complicated. But yeah, that's great. I made a note and we'll figure out a way to incorporate those thoughts because it's very important.
Thank you. Next up is Joe, followed by John and Yoshimi. Joe.
So two quick things. The first thing has to do with you did answer my previous question in the sense that you talked about how we become more efficient, but we still are using more resources, which actually indicates that we need to be more effective. And there are measures that can be put into place for that. Where you become more effective is that you're actually considering the whole, so that you start to think of things like resource depletion, economics, all the circles that you drew, and environmental impact. And there should be a decoupling between all of those things, between growth and the impacts on environment and the impacts of on resources. So there is like this general kind of way of looking at it that at a macro level that may, so, and that was definitely spurred by your idea of saying how efficiency doesn't necessarily answer the problem, because if the system already has a problem and you become more efficient in it, it really doesn't matter. Like you're just doing it faster. And maybe cheaper. But in the second part that I thought that was it kind of goes to Yoshimi's question as well, is that how do you get people to think about holistic thinking and systems thinking? And I think in the way you just have to, it all comes down to the value and the goal that the person has. I think that everybody understands the system to a degree. They're if they have a sustainable business, I think they understand the system, but I don't know if they necessarily take into consideration the ethical part. And that's the other aspect of it. So they're like kind of another, it's more of a problem, I think, of ethics than it is actually understanding the systems itself. But the third thing is that the power of mapping as well, and drawing these pictures out. I think that there's things like called empathy maps that we've walked through here before, which are really important on a number of levels. Mainly, you don't forget the reason you're doing something in the first place. You don't forget the problem that you're actually solving, and you're actually going through the experience that the customer is going through. And then on top of that, where you can start to think of is that how does this fit in? You know, you have your goal of solving a problem, but then you have the goal of doing it. So I think that that's where visually mapping these things out also keeps you within scope. Many times people go outside of the scope of their boundaries when they draw the boundaries. They draw them quite clearly, and then you start to go outside of that. A visual depiction of where what you're actually trying to do is very important, because then you understand scope creep, so to speak. Anyway, those are just some of the thoughts that I had.
Thank you, Joe. Curt, go ahead.
Well, I think those are great thoughts, especially the point that at the beginning to emphasize whole systems mapping, and then to have these bigger picture goals, right? And to have some discussion of that. So that's great. I made a note, and thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Curt. Next up is John and Yoshimi, followed by Maritza.
Yeah, and actually, I'll go further with these bigger picture goals. I would contract and say only do bigger picture goals, and maybe the desired state should only be stated in terms of metaphysical. No physical desired state, only metaphysical, in relationships especially. So if you focus on the relationships, what you want to improve in the relationships or the metaphysical, then what needs to be done in the physical will just fall out of the process. But if you define a physical in desired state, then you end up back where using the same old technology we've used to get here now, going to the trying to achieve a goal with the least amount of damage as possible, instead of that might be the wrong goal. But a process goal or a metaphysical goal or a relationship goal, it's hard to get a bad one.
Excellent.
That builds on what Joe, thanks Joe for that, because I put to my question, what is a system? Understanding what a system is based on ethics and one's values. And I think big picture, that's the greatest challenge we had in our 20 years of facilitation, is to have people, to support people to have the courage to put up a mirror and say, what are your values?
Wonderful. Thank you, Yoshimi. Thank you, John. Next up is going to be Maritza. Maritza, go ahead.
I think my question is a little basic. I apologize after all these deep thinkers. So I understand what we're looking at, diagramming, a system. Where would, or is it incorporated within the dependencies? So often I do a lot of diagramming, but for me, it ends up being a dependency tree. So I look at a lot of things in my life that I need to do from a perspective of dependencies. Like I've made the joke before, I'd love to have a cat, but dependency tree, my basement needs cleaning, or something like that. Again, it just seems silly, but then I can map for you all of the the dependencies that are required in order to get to Z. And I have yet to decide whether this is a hindrance to systems diagramming for myself or not. Or is it not a different? So looking at some of the slides you put up today, I'm looking at life patterns, and you have these separate, you have environment, structured, recycles, everything, and then within them I see diagrammed sections that, to my mind, would potentially be incorporated in each one of them. But then if I were to print out that, for me, I would make branching off comments for several of those, of the dependencies that would be required before one could get there. And it's unclear to me whether or not that is a beneficial thing when one is doing a systems mapping diagram, or is that additional noise that perhaps would be most benefited from leaving to the side until the systems diagramming is a little bit more fully fleshed?
Excellent question. Go ahead, Curt.
Yeah. Well, yes, I think the answer is yes. It's a wonderful thing to put in the process. Obviously, we're just not even hardly scratching the surface, right? If you said, what's the kind of the takeaway McNamara is trying to make here? It's that we already have, a number of well-established, really effective ways to do stuff, we have design thinking, systems, mapping, systems thinking, archetype stuff. Why would we need to look back at, Bucky from ever? And so the answer is because we still haven't incorporated these, larger things. It's not routine. We have this thing where sometimes we say, well, we better go look at the impacts, right? But not always. And so the kind of the big picture of the presentation is we should always look at this, everything we do, right? Everything we do, but without it becoming overwhelming. And so that's, that's sort of like an asterisk at the bottom, right? Because then we can get paralyzed, and that's no good. And so you bring up a really excellent point, which is, so we're doing this very simple first level stuff, which is to say, here's what we have. Oh, we better consider this. We better consider that. And one of the things that you're saying is, well, what's next? And where your mind goes, which is great, which is, oh, well, there's a series of actions for anything to happen, right? And things that have to happen before and things that have to happen after. And so then as we start to explore any part of it, if you will, then coming up with that simple, sequence of steps, dependencies, can be really important. And so it may be that, we discuss a thing where, as you go through and consider aspects of the situation, you work through the first part of something like that, right? You work through the first few dependencies and go to the next and go to the next. One of the reasons to do it, in my mind, is that you're just automatically going to find other things you haven't thought about, right? Like I've spent a lot of time as a system engineer and was active in COSI system engineering organization. And one of the things that people who are, often people are naturals or sometimes get trained, but they start to see, well, sure, we can do that, but you know what that means? Not only can we have to create it, we have to deliver it, we have to maintain it, we have to train people on it, So anyway, what I'm not saying it well, but yes, I think that's a wonderful tool, Maritza, to go in. And in the exploratory stuff, we probably only want it to go a little ways with the intent of unearthing other systems that should be considered before we go further. That's my intuition.
Thank you, Curt. I really like this point. The thing is that I see diagramming as thinking on paper. So you have to get all the things that you think are relevant out on the paper. So including all the dependencies. And it's a tremendously iterative process. So what will happen is that the diagram will get very messy by its nature, but that messiness will actually capture what is there on your mind. So everything that you think is relevant, you get it down. And then you go through the option of saying, okay, now let me try to organize it better. And then use, actually not just organizing, it's actually the way in which the paper works with my mind is just amazing. And I just love the paper, the idea of actually writing things on paper, because and this could be done electronically also. But what it does is that once you have put something, you actually see the dogs that did not bark. Okay, because it's saying, oh, wait a minute, this is missing. And you see that at all kinds of levels. Like you have all of this thing work out, and because your mind was occupied with certain areas, certain aspects of things, you did not have space to think about other things. But because they are offloaded from your active mind onto the paper, and you can see it, you can see the gaps, you can kind of take a breath and you can say, oh, let's see what else. So Maritza, go ahead.
So just a follow-on question. You were talking about sequencing, and what came to mind for me, so, I'm not an engineer. Sometimes I think there's the danger of almost like an analysis paralysis, because there are things which don't have a sequence. So if we're looking at human as whole system, our dependencies will overlap with other aspects of our life. Like if you're livelihood or building, or some of these things may overlap, and it might be almost and maybe that's not the best example, but for some systems there exist items for which it may be almost imperceptible which item would go first in the sequence, because it might be a overlapping. So how would one navigate a scenario like that and manage to still make use of a diagram without getting kind of caught up in that analysis paralysis dissonance?
Curt, go ahead.
Well, in a way, so I mean, there is no magic answer, right? When we start to see things at that level of detail, it's enabling, but once again, like you said, it can lead to that analysis paralysis. What I found with students when I was doing the systems class is that by doing simple diagramming and by doing multiple representations, they often had a much better sense of, oh, these things that seemed like, why does this keep happening to me? I now understand it's part of systemic forces. It really helped them sort of get their arms around it, that get it out of that analysis paralysis. The other thing I'll say is that I took a class once called Robust Decision Making, and there's a book on robust decisions by Ullman, and you don't really need to go read it, but the idea is that it's really kind of a decision. What you're talking about is a decision thing, and this actually, it's a huge area that's also applicable to Bucky navigation, I'm going to call it, which is decision making and processing information. So one of the things to do, of course, is to always have some kind of priorities, to know that there are alternatives to more than one way to do a thing, right? And understand also that my priorities, and let's just say I was doing something with Jeannie, are not the same as Jeannie's. And so if we're going to make a decision together, we need to actually know what our priorities are, as well as how we rank them. And I had an example in the old days of having two old cars and how to decide whether to keep both old cars or just keep one and sell, or get a different one or whatever. And as I went through, I tried to consider different people and how this impacted them. And it was very, very interesting. So anyway, having simple ways to do it. Another thing you may or may not bump into is that decision-making can be hard in organizations, because people who are speak a lot of meetings may appear to have a lot of experience, but they actually don't always. And so then Ullman has some decision-making software, uses what's called Bayesian probability, which I don't really understand, but the idea is that you get people to quantify, oh, so you're saying this is definitely the best alternative. what is that based on? Like, do you have direct experience doing this kind of thing? Did you have a buddy that did something like it? Have you read about it? You know what I'm saying? So anyway, to me, it's, having a small and fast little sort of decision matrix or whatever, you can quickly run it. And it turns out once you actually start writing this stuff down and putting it in, it's really surprising. I mean, it's about this much space in a spreadsheet, right? So I think it will become almost automatic. So anyway, it's not getting magic, but that's what I do when faced with what seems so.
Okay, thank you, Curt. I'm going to make a quick comment, and then we'll get some new people in line. It's Bill and David, and then we'll cycle through everybody else. The biggest thing that I always have to watch out for is that map is not the territory, because the diagram is the map that you've created of the territory. You have to be aware that the territory is much, 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 much larger typically. So that's why getting other people to produce their maps, not just comment on your maps, because then they are going to be biased with that. So getting them to produce. And when you are actually trying to take more information on the subject, try to kind of actually redo almost the map, add to it. So realize that, the map is not the territory. Don't be too wedded to the diagram that you have. Okay, next up is going to be Bill, David, and then we'll cycle through everybody, John, Yashimi, Jeannie, and Joe. All right, so Bill, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to make a comment that ties together what Jeannie mentioned and what Katie mentioned and what John mentioned. Jeannie raised the question I think it was Jeannie who raised the question how to induce people to engage in more system thinking. Katie raised the question of what happens when the physical system and the relationship system are analyzed separately, or you can't get the people in the relationship system to recognize what's going on in the physical system. And John talked about how I assume John was talking about consulting for business firms, where in business firms, getting the metaphysical to change first is what induces people to make changes in the physical system. So I want to frame all of this in terms of the way political economists think about negative externalities. So an negative externality is the link between motivated individual self-interested behavior and negative consequences for the system as a whole. So when emitters of a negative externality incur the cost of reining in the negative effects of their behavior, it has beneficial effects for the system. So what system thinking is, from this perspective, is it's somehow inducing the emitters of negative externalities to incur the material costs of reining in the negative effects of their own behavior. And you can think of lots of different examples, but that's the basic framework of how you get from, individual and group thinking to system thinking. And so political economists have identified 4 main ways to induce the emitter of a negative externality to incur the material costs themselves of reining in their emission behavior. It could be pollution emission or any other kinds of negative effects of their own behavior. One is compulsory through law, by somehow getting a law passed. And each of these 4 methods has advantages and disadvantages, benefits and costs that make it appropriate or inappropriate for the particular situation. The first method is compulsory, by getting a law passed. The second is, well, that first method, you could call it the sticks method as opposed to carrots. So the first method is compulsion through law and sticks, backed by enforcement, law enforcement. The second is carrots, which is kind of reaching a deal where you pay off somehow the emitter of the negative externality with a side payment that's greater than their material costs that they would incur by reining themselves in. So it's in their net interest, appealing to their self-interest, which is voluntary, not compulsory. The third method is to induce the emitter of the negative externality to change their own causal beliefs about the causal relationship between their own behavior and their own self-interest. And the fourth method is to induce the emitter of the externality to change their values. So each one of those 4 methods leads down a different path of analysis as to how you kind of implement that method in a specific situation, and which method is the right method for a particular problem will depend on the particular problem and, et cetera. But that's I think I've covered the main ways that political economists think about how you get from individual to system level thinking. And there's lots of historical examples of successes and failures in the effort to induce emitters to rein in a negative externality. Even including before the Industrial Revolution created, pollution from factories, et cetera. So I'll stop there, and I hope that helps.
That was excellent, Bill. I really appreciate all the points that you bring in. You come from you basically bring in kind of ideas from a different field that are connected to whatever we are discussing. And you've done this multiple times. Really appreciate that. Thank you. Next up is David. David, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So I'm on late, so yeah, I kind of joined late. So
All right, that's fine. We're talking about diagramming. So whenever you would like to ask anything or comment on anything, just go ahead and type ! And you can come back in.
Okay.
All right, thanks. Next up is going to be John and Yoshimi, followed by Jeannie and Joe. John and Yoshimi.
Yeah, I was going to comment on a tip, basically on my experience when I used to write user manuals for computer systems that relate to to Maritz's concern about analysis paralysis. So what I used to do for writing a computer manual is you first have to figure out what the computer can do. And so you write down what the computer can do. And that turns out to be what I call TBU, true but useless, because that's not what the user needs. That's the current state of the system. It's not what you need to do. You need to start again and write a manual that says, okay, in this situation, this is what you need to do with the computer. So your initial, dump of all the dependencies, great, really, really good process. Now consider it true but useless. What are you going to do? Now what are you going to do? And that's when you start making decisions about the priorities. Okay, there are these dependencies. I'm going to make a decision about this in order to get to there. So you have to let go of the current state and say, what is it that I want to do that takes account of the current state in the best way I can?
Excellent.
So I use that true but useless so many times. Okay, what I've written is true but useless. Now I have to rewrite it.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, John. Next up is going to be Jeannie. Jeannie, go ahead.
Well, I wanted to bring in this thing about the next steps, which just, piqued my interest. I'm not really sure what Yoshimi was talking about exactly. But I think for many people, just taking a step is a big it's a big step to take a step. And I think, part of the problem is it's linear thinking. So they see that they're going from here to here, but there's only one way to get there. So at least in the diagramming, you have a possibility of putting different steps that might take you from one place to another. So you're already, getting into a second dimension. And I was just thinking about, how a diagram can really maybe help people even take one step or think of a step to take. I think it's, I just see so many people that won't even, take one step. So I don't know, this isn't really a question, but maybe you have a comment on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeannie. Curt, go ahead.
Yeah, so thanks. That's wonderful. So tinkering, right? That's there are a number of books about tinkering is really how evolution works, that there are these changes and then they're tested, and that it's a really good strategy. That's obviously a lot of inventions came out of tinkering, and Bucky was big on inventions. And the other thing I liked about the discussion, Jeannie, is that, the possibility thinking, right? I can't see a way across the stream, but I can see the first rock. I could get on the first rock. Knowing that I'm on the first rock, I can see things differently. Maybe I'll see a different one. Or Edward de Bono in his lateral thinking, much of what he's saying is, we often tend to just go lockstep like this, the next thing. But if we stop and say, oh, but what if I did this? What if I did that? Or even if I jump to somewhere impossible, he has a lot of techniques for impossible thinking. Poe is one of them. Poe, they pay you to buy the car. What does that develop? And the idea is that once you actually embrace, at least temporarily, something impossible, you see the situation differently, right? And then you can then go a little bit. So you may never go there, but you've got a whole different perspective from doing it. So yeah, it's very powerful stuff, you guys.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe, David, and Bill. Joe.
Yeah, one of the things that actually, we talk about the value of diagramming, and when we're talking about, putting down your goals, your initiatives, and actually the tasks that are associated with it, but it also tests the principles by which you're actually operating on over. And so, like, if you're actually diagramming out what your main principles are, your actions actually just come out naturally underneath that. Then to see where things interrelate to one another. So that's another advantage I've found in trying to map things out, where you're looking at least a framework in this particular instance of a way of thinking about a system. And then you can, and that ultimately can relate back to your values as well, because you look at things that within that framework, you start to look at things you could change, things you can do better, or new things that you can do. So I think that there are there's 3 or 4 different ways of kind of slicing that up, that you really can start to build an effective model. But the main point that I was making is that it really kind of tests the principles that you've set out, and values as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Let's go with Paul. Paul hasn't spoken yet. Paul, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, Curt, I'm what you said just a few minutes ago got closest to what I'm thinking about. We've been talking about dependencies, and I wanted to just focus on another element, which is assumptions, and talk about, and hear you talk about how one builds a method of challenging one's assumptions into the diagramming of the system, because it's so important. Because if you are putting an implicit assumption into a way you've diagrammed the system, you're constraining yourself, and it happens all the time. And one example of it is a implicit sort of guess at the probability of a certain event occurring. Another of it is a misunderstanding of what a concept you're thinking will be helpful will have as a side effect, for instance, which Bucky would love to hear about, I talk about, I think. But that whole thing of how do we do these diagrams in a way, or is there a method that we can use to challenge our unconscious assumption, pull out the dog that doesn't bark, Shrikant said, pull out our unconscious assumptions and clarify them, expose them for what they are. That's my question. Thank you.
Well, so, practice with what I described before. So if we're making a rich picture, and the book I put in as a reference is Growing Wings on the Way by Armson, and she's talking about how her and her sisters were worried about mom being able to take care of herself. And the worry was, it was kind of all over. And they said, well, what are we actually worried about? Well, is she, taking care of her health? Is she getting her meds? Is she getting her to appointments? Oh, we're worried about how she's feeding herself. Well, what does that, come down to? And so then what they were able to do, because they had multiple points of view, is create this composite thing, which helped them sort through what they thought were the most significant things, and then ask more focused questions and see where mom actually needed help. And so this is true also a thing called gigamapping. I almost had it in the presentation. It's RSD gigamapping. I'll try and put a link in if I have a minute. Where you draw really big maps. You know, you have a whole big butcher block paper and a bunch of people around a table and you're each drawing stuff and you come up with a composite view. So what are these things getting at? Multiple viewpoints, right? If we're just using one viewpoint, which is either ours or our team at work, and we tend to think this way, we're going to be in trouble, right? We're going to miss all kind of stuff. And just from a business strategy sense, you know, this is not the best way. What's the other one? Well, I think it's Bucky's design science disciplines, sometimes known as strategies, which I showed you briefly, but I do think they should be updated and made a little more accessible. But what he's suggesting is that we're continually aware of things, you know, from a variety of standpoints, you know, latest science, latest geography, education, etc. So then forcing ourselves to take those different points of views. So if we don't have a team doing it, then beyond that, I think, yeah, we can be developing some tools, can't we? Which sort of, you know, force the thing. In trees, you know, I showed you that 9-window thing, and they'll often do it and they'll say, well, here's one that's based on the challenge, right? So it's the past, present, and future of the challenge. Here's the same one, so we just sort of copy it over, but now it's on resources. And now we're going to examine the resources in the past, present, and future. Here's one, and then they go and do a whole different thing. So trees has a fairly structured method of doing it. And if you're interested in that, Daryl Mann's book on inventive problem solving, I think, anyway, is very good. So it's really hard, but the basic thing is it's a multiple mind problem, right? It's not a single mind thing, I think.
Thank you, Curt. Curt, I know that you need to leave in 4 minutes, but after Curt leaves, I do have some questions about diagramming that I would like to put on the table. It's a topic of great interest. Curt, if you can stay, you are welcome to stay. But if you have to go, you have to go. Let's go with David, followed by Bill, and then I'll go ahead and ask the questions. David, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah. So yeah, I just joined you guys like last week. The Gospel of John. So just wanted to further introduce myself. So I am from the backyard. I responded to Strickant. Thanks for getting back. I'm from the backyard of New York metropolitan area. So the only state that is the spirit of, it's the only New England state of the New York metropolitan area. So I'm from Connecticut. So
wonderful. Welcome. And glad to have you here. Let's go with Bill. Bill, go ahead.
Thanks. 5 or 10 minutes ago, Curt mentioned the word practice in passing. I wanted to expand on the concept of practice because it connects together a number of things that people have talked about in the last 20 minutes. So in terms of just examples to have in mind as I fill out the properties of a practice and the functions of those elements, a medical practice, a law practice, a pianist doing practice, a meditation practitioner doing meditation practice, a carpenter practicing his trade. All of these things have in common certain main elements of a practice. First, a practice linearizes a very complicated system into a series of actual steps to take in one's actions. Or in the case of a meditation practice, in one's thoughts. You should add to the list of examples a therapy practice, which has a linear sequence for feelings, okay? So it linearizes a complex system for purposes of being able to have practical steps to take in a certain order. And the order in which those steps are taken in the practice, it has to be a certain order to have positive effects and avoid negative effects. But the order might not be perfect because one hasn't figured out the full dimensions of the causal mechanisms driving the system. For example, cooking is according to a recipe. A recipe is a linear list of steps to be taken one after the other. But as you do it, you might discover, oh, it tastes a little off. The final product tastes a little off. And this way, let's tinker with the recipe. Let's get the order changed or add some more ingredients. It's the same with all practices. So a good practice, a well-designed practice combines, looking at the results each time and being able to tinker, was the one word that was used, or tweak, but have your tweaks be protected against severe negative side effects of tweaking too much. Have your tweaks be incremental instead of massive in a way that causes unintended negative side effects of tweaking. One other, I don't want to go on too long here. I think the properties of a good practice, the list would be longer, but just one other one that I would mention is that a practice kind of boils a complex system down sometimes to a subset that one is going to work with, one subset of the system at a time, because it's manageable. So a good practice rules out certain things. We're not dealing with that now. We're just dealing with certain sub-elements. So, but the main reason I wanted to mention practice is because it incorporates Bayesian updating, which Curt mentioned. But Bayesian updating is basically just incorporating new information to modify one's model that one has in mind of the causal mechanisms involved, and then draw implications for how one should modify the practical steps that one takes. Learning from experience is another name for Bayesian updating. Learning by doing, the way a carpenter, I'll close with this simple example. A carpenter realizes that when he doesn't, sweep up the dust from all the sawing that he did before doing the painting, then there's dust on the boards when he paints, and the dust gets laid underneath the paint, so he realizes I need to tweak the order in which I do things and insert a step called sweeping up the dust before I do the painting. But the point I was making there is simply that you're updating, you're learning from experience, but it's organized. It's an organized way of doing it. So I hope that helps. I'll stop.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Curt, any comments or any final comments?
Well,
and then
thanks,
I'm going to
everybody.
raise- Go ahead.
And yeah, to Bill's comments, there's a definition of a professional as somebody who is a reflective practitioner, which is what you just described. And there's a book by Donald Schoen, I think, called that, that you continually look at what you did, do it better next time. And then your comments also reminded me of the Cynefin framework, which is of complex systems, and how all systems go from a state of highly structured order. There's a 4-phase process, and depending on what you're involved in, it could be a superstructured system where it's an efficiency improvement, or it could be things that have fallen apart and it's chaotic and you're trying to make your first attempts at solving it. Anyway, for each of those things, I'll put a link in the chat from the Wikipedia article. There's different strategies. So if you have an idea, you're in this sort of environment, you do these sort of strategies, that sort of process, to your point. If you're in this sort of environment, you do these kind of strategies. And some people call this sense making. So yeah, thanks everybody. I'm gonna turn off the camera. I'll try and listen for a little bit. I got a couple of things to do, but it's been very useful.
Thank you. Thank you, Curt.
Shrikant, could I just add 1 or 2 brief points on this practice notion?
Yes, please.
Okay, so it combines deduction and induction. Induction is learning from experience. There's certain lessons you can only learn by doing. You can't learn them by sitting down and figuring it out analytically. But then you take the lessons learned from experience and you go back to the model and deductively tweak the model. And a practice is always built on the assumption that all induction won't get you where you need to go, and all deduction won't get you where you need to go. You need to go back and forth iteratively. And that leads to my second and final point, which is that a practice is repetitive. It's repetitive because there's at least 2 reasons. One, there's certain, well, I'll leave the reasons out. I said I would be brief. So the point is that it's repetitive, but there's reasons why it's repetitive. And the idea is committing to a practice has benefits in the sense that you're doing it almost the same way each time, except for the little tweaks. But doing it almost the same way each time has benefits, which I'll circle back to another day. Thanks for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. So I want to actually make a quick comment about the Bayesian method. It's really brilliant way of thinking about it, because it's my favorite formulation of it. This is by Sapolsky. It is strong opinions weakly held. So you always have to have the best idea of this is as best as I know, but you have to hold it weakly in the sense that you have to use your experience to update it on a continual basis. You have to be completely committed to that. So there is that loop that goes on. And actually this loop goes on in everything that you do. But this is the, OODA loop that John Boyd, we studied with, the OODA loop by John Boyd, where you're continuously going through the cycle: observe, orient, decide, and act. And when you act, you look and see what has happened, and you reorient yourself on a continual basis. Now, the question I want to put on the table is, diagramming is one way of putting things on paper. The other way is writing, and writing is sequential. Another way of getting things out is actually speaking. So what is the role of diagramming with respect to all these other tools that you have of writing sequentially or speaking and diagramming? How do you use these things? What is good for what? When would you use it? What combination do you use it? So any thoughts about putting diagramming in the context of these other techniques that we have? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to comment. We're going to start with David. David, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So most recently, so I've been at a call center where you're getting customers who just accidentally ordered an extra like as seen on TV product. So I'm like wondering, how are we still, obviously this is 2023, like how are we still doing business this way, like third party anyway? Not specifically about diagramming, but
okay, that's fine. Let's go to Joe. Joe, go ahead.
I'll just be really brief on this. I think diagramming in a way can serve as an outline to a certain degree on how to get your thoughts on paper. But more importantly, I think what a diagram does is it makes you put words to the relationships in a diagram. So in other words, if I'm calling something a goal, or I'm calling something an objective, and I'm calling something an initiative, you're defining those words by what they are in the process. So that once you have definitions that are clear, it helps you write clearly with the communication and who you're talking and who you're speaking with. So that's one of the most important things when you're talking about even capabilities or things along those lines, is that you have capabilities drawn out into a framework. And then how those capabilities are actually then defined. Then the person reading it actually understands what you're talking about, because these things, sometimes we use so many words interchangeably that we get lost in the translation. And so I think that, that's something that's where it's really beneficial to kind of draw things out and then start to put words to them, and to make sure that everybody's on the same page, because then they can see the visual diagram and then they can see the written word underneath it. So I think they complement each other. And actually, I'd say they're probably to a certain extent essential, because you have something that the reader is looking at, they're getting it, but then they can read the detail as to how you're actually going to do it. I can say initiative, but if I write out then what that initiative means and what it is, like, and why you're doing it, you can put all kinds of a narrative to those terms. And I think that that's the most important thing. Not the most, it's one important thing.
Thank you, Joe. So I want to kind of broaden the question here. Another way of looking at it is what is visual, which your mind hits at the same time, and what is sequential. And there are things that you need, like if you want to do something, you're going to do it sequentially. So you have to kind of convert it, as Bill was pointing out, you have to convert it into a process. Some things you have to convert it into a process. And many times you don't know what that process is, and you have to probably put things down to try to tease out the relationship, and then do the sequence at the end. So it's all, there's a very interesting kind of play that happens between these things. John and Yoshimi, followed by Bill.
I think it has a lot to do with learning styles. And I agree with Joe, it's a blended, to cover all our bases when we're trying to facilitate or trying to express ourselves. Always consider the learning style. For David, if you're talking about customers and products and orders and so forth, I think of the time I had to teach or make sure the chlorine level in the swimming pool didn't kill our customers. And so the manual, I couldn't even understand the manual, and I took a course. So I drew a picture. No, I took a photograph of what the knobs are supposed to look like and where they're supposed to be positioned. I said, okay, guys, they have to be in this position, and you could tell the pH level, etc. But because first I asked them to just read the manual. There's no way I knew. So it's our responsibility to understand first our learning style, because not everyone has our learning style, and to acknowledge that, but to acknowledge there's at least 3 or 4 different other learning styles in your audience. So getting to know your audience or the listener.
Wonderful.
Help.
Excellent point. Let's go. DLJ hasn't spoken yet, so let's go to DLJ followed by Bill. DLJ.
Ooh, privilege. My sound all right? Yeah.
Yes.
Always do.
Thank you. So yes, a good question. I sketch models a lot professionally and for pleasure. Yeah, so essentially networks and nodes, connections, relationships. You're joining the dots, and then you're also doing gap analysis, right? You're seeing, so think periodic table as if you want a visual. They start with a whole bunch of, like, we know these bits, and then you think, well, hang on a second. If this is the right pattern, then shouldn't there be a oxygen there? That kind of thing, right? It also, when things don't fit, is useful, because you realize you've got the wrong dots, the wrong wrong relationships or wrong nodes in the wrong places, things that shouldn't be there, or indeed incorrect assumptions. So that's the continual improvement part. You're not just getting better at using a model, you're getting better at getting better, because you think, you're learning how to learn, right? That'll do. Thanks.
Thanks, DLJ. Next up is Bill. Bill, go ahead.
Thanks. I want to address your previous question about the connection between words on one hand and diagrams on the other hand. It reminds me of what I heard many years ago about the difference between the right brain and the left brain. The way I heard it, the difference defined is that the right brain processes things that do not have an inherent time sequence to them, like smells, sounds, tastes, and emotions. A smell is what it is, no matter how long or short you smell it. Same with a sound, it is the sound it is, no matter how long or short you hear it. Same with the feeling, same with the taste. Whereas that's the right brain. And the left brain processes things that do have an inherent time sequence, like language, like a food recipe that you're cooking, like analysis, all sorts of causal analysis. And so the diagrams are visual. Also another thing back on the right side, the right brain that does not have an inherent time sequence is space. So if you look at an object in space, it is what it is, no matter how long or short you look at it. So diagrams are visual, they're spatial, so it's right brain, whereas words are sequential, analytical, they're left brain. So my assumption, I'm not a neuroscientist, but my assumption is if a neuroscientist were in the room, he would say, yeah, you need both your right brain and your left brain to navigate your own life and your relationships cooperatively with others, etc. And so ultimately learning, at least one component of learning is probably building connections between left brain and right brain. So if you only have a diagram with no words on it, and it's only spatial, you're not going to be able to build as many connections, or the connections you need is if you've got words on it as well. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, that's great point. I mean, this is really, really fascinating stuff because, this distinction between right brain and left brain, and it's a very large descriptor. For example, the right brain is very good at looking at patterns. It is very good at saying what is missing. It is where your suspicions of, oh, I'm missing something, come from. Whereas the left brain is very purposeful, directed, saying, okay, I'm going to do this next. I'm going to do this next. And so there's so many things to be said about this. One is that the extent to which people use these are differ. So there is individual differences, definitely. There is also different tasks which require different things. You need to have certain things which are done sequentially. Also at different stages, it is, another way of looking at it is that the left brain is order and the right brain can handle chaos much better. So it's a question of when are you talking about it? Like at different stages, you will want to engage your right brain. And so to have both these things, to be ambidextrous really is very, very powerful. And to kind of be able to go back and forth as best as you can. And then to the extent and still realize that you're going to have some strengths and weaknesses, and then work with people who have the other thing going so that you can work together and fix things together. So excellent points. Go ahead.
Can I chime in briefly? Because
yes,
what you
please.
said reminded me of something very, very significant, which is, and I'll ask this question, everyone in the Zoom room tonight. Have you ever had a flash of intuition that occurs to you in 2 seconds? The entire flash of intuition occurs to you in 2 seconds, but then when it's time to explain it to someone verbally, it takes you 5 minutes to explain it?
Always.
Right. So that all that information that takes 5 minutes to say verbally, all of that information was encapsulated in that 2-second flash of intuition. It was all in there. But it just, the right brain where the flash of intuition occurs, computed it in just a different way that it could all be there in 2 seconds. And so from this perspective, it's about the function. One function of the left brain is to receive these flashes of intuition from the right brain and sort them out to figure out a few things. Is it useful? Is it not useful? Is it productive? Is it counterproductive? Is it partly productive and partly counterproductive? Which part is productive? Which part's counterproductive? And then the other function of the left brain is to kind of distill it to the practical action plan, which often is a linear, sequential, step-by-step, recipe, say for cooking food or for performing a shoulder operation, like I had done on my shoulder a couple of years ago. So I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
No, excellent point. So, I mean, if you look at it, like brain is this massive network, and the right brain is actually kind of producing this 2-second or even a much shorter result from all of this network being activated to form something. Now, our language, when you're talking to people, it's really amazing. It's like, I'm always amazed. Like you have this tremendous network, right? Of 100 billion neurons with, I don't know how many trillion connections to it. And that is processing things. And so does everybody here. And we have this tool of language, which is words produced sequentially. So actually, isn't it amazing that we can actually do this? That we can talk a sentence and this massive connection can communicate at least something, but if you're not very good at, I'm not very good at communication, and and you have to do a lot of handshaking. That's another thing. You have to say, this is what I say. Okay, I hear you saying this. Is that true? And then you say, no, you got some things, but this one is more. So you have to do a lot of handshaking, and you really have to pay attention to that network of that other person. What do they know? What do they not know? What can I take for granted? What is it that is going to be easy for them to grasp? And you're trying to put things on the line which will fire that network so that at least something of whatever you are saying fires there. So it is a truly magnificent thing that goes on when two people are talking like this, you know. So thank you. Next up is going to be Paul.
Yeah, I love these left-right brain thoughts, Srikant. And to Bill's point, you guys are stimulating a whole new method of envisioning solutions in my mind now that I'm going to try at some point, because why aren't we talking about engaging all five senses? If words are words and pictures engage sight, well, if we're gonna really hack the right brain into the picture, maybe we take a vision of we're in a clean energy factory that is actually using coal, but I'm just doing a wild example, but producing no emissions that are greenhouse gases. Now we're going to go in there like hypnotically in a trance state. What is a smell? What is the sound I'm hearing? Oh, wow, that's a really high whine. What machine is doing that? That's getting, oh, that smells like potatoes. Why are there potatoes? So I'm just proposing that we expand our thinking from using diagramming, which gets sight involved, to all five senses to get the goals you guys are talking about on the table.
Thank you, Paul. Very intriguing suggestion. It's just that each sense has its own history, natural history, and some things are better at doing certain things. So smell is, for example, smell or taste are very old senses, and they're able to do certain things, and they are able to do certain things very, very well. Vision is a very different kind of a sense. Audio is a very different kind of a sense. And in terms of like the kind of processing that we are doing for general purpose problems, the visual and audio is where most of the work is taking place. The other senses actually undergird it. There are other senses, like, for example, movement, right? You move. Like when you're doing models, for example, or you're acting, you're actually using your body. And that kinesthetic sense is also there. So it's absolutely about the whole, it's about using all the senses, but each sense has its own nature. And you have to figure that out and see it come for this one. Go ahead, Paul.
I just want to, thanks for letting me just briefly, yes, everything you're saying makes sense to me. And I just want to add the nuance that I'm getting at, which is we're very much smarter than we think, and we have more neural connections in our brain than we think. So you might trigger by that method of enlisting a more primitive sense that doesn't seem like it should be involved, a link between two concepts in your unconscious that you can expose that way. It's sort of like a trick to explore your own internal network of memories, for instance. So
no, I mean, the interesting thing is it happens. Like, for example, I mean, I come from India. So certain smells in the tropics will have a certain impact on me, and I will not even know that is what is going on. But then later on, I would say, oh, this is actually, I smell rain coming, because I know how to, I have the experience of that, what it smells like before the rain. So something like that. It's a very odd thing, but okay, wonderful. Let's see, it's going to be David followed by Jeannie. David.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to say the link that I left is, if anyone wants to review it, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thanks. You're welcome to put anything in the chat. Okay.
Oh.
Thank you. Next up is Jeannie.
Well, I wanted to say about diagramming is I love that it's not necessarily sequential. I mean, you can start with your goal and work absolutely backwards to see how you want to get there. And if your diagram is big enough, you can go back and put in the dependencies later, after you've sort of figured out what you're diagramming, and then, stick more things in there. And then you can overlay, I like to use tracing paper and stuff, but, you could put an overlay, like, how do you feel about this whole thing the next day or under a different circumstance? And then you could use color, so the colors could represent, different aspects of the diagram. And all these things are, not available in just talking.
Yeah, Jeannie, if I may, may I talk a little bit about your Dante diagram?
Sure.
Okay, so we were doing this series of meetups on, Dante, Divine Comedy. And what Jeannie was doing was that she was preparing this roll, this giant roll of, Dante's Divine Comedy being illustrated. The whole, so it was like this giant roll of paper illustrating all of Divine Comedy. Okay, now, so realize that, what we are able to do as human beings is quite incredible. And I mean, one of the things that, artists do is that, and this is true for both, visual artists, writers, as well as music, is that they can show you new patterns that you have not seen before. And they are going to create, what Owen Barfield calls this felt consciousness of something new, that, aha, I saw something that I did not see before, because it is a new pattern, a new idea that lights up your mind. And that is what human artifacts are capable of doing. So this is not just like a everyday thing. This can have like metaphysical values, or deep psychological values. Go ahead, Jeannie.
I wanted to add, you could put pictograms in there too, so you don't actually even have to use words.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe. Joe, go ahead.
It was just interesting, actually, that you brought up the storytelling aspect of it. That's another thing that actually if you can do that visually, it will connect with somebody on a different level. And it actually brings new ideas into the consciousness. But one thing we talked about a lot this evening as well is boundaries. And when you draw them visually, it becomes much more clear where the boundaries are and what's outside the boundary, and then starting to think about what else could be possible. So it starts to really, almost like a word is a boundary. It creates a boundary in and of itself. So you're drawing this now, and you're visually depicting it, and then new ideas can stem from it. And we saw that with the circles of relevancy that Curt had proposed a little bit earlier. Those are very deep circles. Like if we could spend a whole session going on about those. But anyway, that's just another way of looking at it.
Thank you. I want to just expand a little bit on the senses. People like Leonardo, for example, Leonardo da Vinci has this idea of kind of common sense. They call it common sense. So basically, like all senses kind of come together to have a certain impression. Thomas Aquinas also calls it common sense. So it is how different senses kind of play with each other. There is this correspondence between sounds and shapes. There is this famous Kiki Booba experiment of, it's like people were asked, okay, there are these two shapes, one spiky shape and one cloud-like shape. And they asked, which one is Kiki and which one is Booba? And almost everybody gave the same answer. Okay. They also had like different colors, one orange and one purple. And they said, okay, which one is Kiki and which one is Booba? Again, the same answer, common answer. So there is I don't know exactly the term for it, but there is a correspondence between the sounds and visual things and the movement clearly for movement. And like great artists use all of these, you can see that in movies, or movies or theater. That's where all of these things have to come together. So so it's a very, very large issue, and we just touched on it. And so firstly, I want to thank everybody. This is really amazing meetups. I want to tell you about some meetups that are coming up. Next week, we're going to have Stroopy. He's going to show us how to build things with beads and strings, how to make tetrahedrons, octahedrons. I don't know how far he can go, maybe icosahedrons too. He can do that in his sleep, but he's going to actually show us how to do that using different materials. So look at the meetup page. It's not been updated yet, but look at the meetup page. He's going to suggest some materials to have handy so you can actually try these things out. I strongly recommend it. I was inspired to build all kinds of things with it. Let me just show you this. So see, this is the result of Stroopy's ideas. I'm using straw and string here, but I want to see what happens when you use beads. The thing is that, again, this is about the models, the facility you have with building models. So typically the bead models are small, so you can combine them. You can combine a whole bunch of tetrahedrons, for example, to see what we can do. And Stroopy is just brilliant at it. So don't miss that. The week after that, I'm going to have Don, and he's going to be talking about there's this field structure, I think he calls it. He's going to be talking about, it's a different notion of geometry that he has. And he's going to be telling us about that. It's going to be a challenging thing to kind of reduce it to something that everybody can understand. But I think Don is very much capable of doing that. So I'm really looking forward to that. All right. So thank you very much, everybody. And we will see you. We'll see you soon. All right. And let's see what else. Let me tell you what else is coming up. Monday is Poetry Mondays. Tuesdays, we got last 2 sessions of Art of War, and then we go to Confucius. This Wednesday, Sanjay will be here talking about neuroscience. This Thursdays, we are doing Stoicism. This is Stoic Thursdays. So every Thursday is going to be Stoicism. We are focusing on Seneca, who's the most practical of the Stoics, great Stoics that I have seen. And he's just brilliant. We're going through his moral letters. They're just gems, very short, very easy to read, and they're just gems. On this Friday, I don't know what we're going to schedule something. I'll let you know. And then Saturday, we are going to be back to doing Asian philosophy. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. See you soon.